Hey guys, we'll just wait a few more moments for a few others to join. I think we've got quite a few more subscribed. So yeah, we'll just give it a few minutes and then get underway. But otherwise, welcome. I've also just populated a few notes into the meeting notes. You might be able to see there. The idea of this session is a little bit different to usual, so just have a read through that, but I'll go over them once we get started in a couple of minutes. Cheers. All right, I think without further ado, let's get started. I know that our Australian contingent is probably going to be itching to get to lunch by the end of this, and I'd say our New Zealand contingent is probably just on the way back from, so there'll be a few more stragglers in that bunch, I'd imagine. But yeah, let's just make as much use of the time that we've got here, so we can get through as much as we can. This is a kind of a different session than we've actually run before, so I guess it's a little bit of trial and error for me and for Locus. So hopefully everything runs smoothly, and I apologize if not. I guess the idea of this session though is probably just to make it a little bit less of a kind of a webinar feel where we've got me speaking the whole time and just going ahead with a pre-prepared presentation. And I think we want to run this with a bit more interaction from you guys because I guess I run out of ideas of what you might want to see. So sometimes it's a bit nice to actually hear what it is that you want to learn with, I guess, a bit of a topic in mind anyway. The idea of this session is automating automation with the FME Server REST API. It's been a while since I think we've given a presentation on the FME Server REST API. So given the kind of upsurge in terms of FME Server usage, and I think in particular a few, I guess, trends of where the product is heading, I think the product has developed quite a bit. So it might be a timely period to start looking at the FME Server REST API as that platform kind of grows. The fact that you're probably invited to the session indicates that you probably know Locus already. You either know John or Ruby, I would imagine, without a doubt. If you haven't met me, I'm Kieran O'Donnell. I work in, I guess, the data solutions sort of space, and my focus has always been on automation. If you have tuned into one of our webinars in the past, you'll have seen I like hacking around with APIs quite a lot, and I come from a strong GIS background, but I guess I'm slowly out of that space and getting a little bit different, more systems and web-based. we're in lockdown here in Auckland at the moment, so I've decided that anytime I'm doing a presentation and I'm not allowed to go to the pub, I'm going to show my picture with a mask on. Yeah, a little bit of housekeeping for this session. We really do want your suggestions and your feedback. I know it is a little bit hard sometimes with a bigger group or speaking to a lot of people that you don't know as well. So what I've actually done is set up an FME Server app in order for you all to register sort of your suggestions and your feedback. So maybe take down that link if you have a moment. But that is based on the FME server, which we're going to be interacting with throughout this session. So that's fme.kierano'donnell.com/FME server/apps/ask. I apologize, that's a bit long. Decided to pick a domain for my name rather than use the IP address of the AWS machine that we're using at the moment. I thought that might be a bit tricky to get anyone to remember that. And just as a bit of housekeeping, please do keep your microphone on mute at all times unless you're speaking. Sometimes it gets a bit awkward when I'm getting feedback. I get very distracted from what I'm actually saying because I can hear myself speaking back to myself as well. So thanks for that in advance. On that note as well, I will perhaps maybe call on you if you make a suggestion and I need some elaboration on what it is that you want to look at. Sometimes it's good to get an understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve with a suggestion. So I may call on you to kind of elaborate on that, and you're more than welcome to speak and turn your camera on and have a chat to the group as well. If you'd rather not, because I understand that's not for everyone, feel free to just write your name as anonymous and I'll try and read between the lines. So the FME Server REST API, if you haven't used it, is a very handy tool for, I guess, an FME systems administrator. One of the really great things about sort of these web-based GUI products or products with a GUI that you interact with is that they are very easy to, create things, schedule things, and interact with them in the web. But one of the harder things, if you've come from probably a data background, which is how you've ended up an FME administrator, is that you don't have those in kind of a workable tabular format that you can actually interact with. So the FME Server REST API is basically a great way to interact with that and pull things out systematically, turn it into data which is workable, as opposed to kind of buttons which you click on in the web interface. If you haven't worked with REST APIs before, they are really simple, I guess. In my view anyway, and easy to use without needing a heavy background as a developer. I think when you start using them, they can be a little bit overwhelming because, say myself, I come from a GIS background, used to working with geometry, with geodatabases, SDE tables. Then you start delving into a space where you've got to deal with headers and cookies and query parameters, unpacking JSON. It is a little bit daunting. So hopefully this session can help to maybe dispel some of those thoughts that it is hard, because I think it is quite easy to work with once you get over a few hurdles. And this FME Server REST API just allows you to interact with FME Server using the simplicity of the HTTP protocol, which is quite easy to use. What can you do with it? Pretty much anything that you could do via the FME Server web interface, but the benefit is that you can do it systematically and use a process to do it rather than doing it yourself. Kind of like what I refer to in all of the tasks that I have to do, and I guess why I've found such a love, for lack of a better word, for FME is the fact that it allows me to be pretty lazy in terms of what I actually have to do. If there's a process that you need to do, get something else to do that for you, rather than do it manually yourself every single time. So you can perform queries against the FME server to do a health check to see if everything's running okay, get some of the system information, check that the license is still valid, if it's going to expire, start harassing Ruby or John to get you a new one, all that kind of thing. You can check your job history. So rather than logging in first thing in the morning, once you reach the office and seeing what ran and what the feature counts were and what failed, hopefully nothing, you can use the REST API to extract all of that information for you and send you a concise formatted report, which gives you all that summary you can read on the bus or the train on the way to work if you're not busy doing something else. You could run a workspace with customizable parameters the same way that you would via the web interface, but running it from another piece of software or another program instead of actually having to click all the buttons. Managing your tokens, users, roles, permissions, all that kind of thing. It's all possible with the FME Server REST API. How do you access it? There's a lot of, I guess, options that you've got out there because REST APIs are very much a standard. You can use any program which is capable of making HTTP requests. FME Workbench does work well, extremely well with the FME Server REST API, and that very much is a perk of being developed by the same company. If you've done any other work with APIs in the past and tried to interact with it with FME, probably one of the things that you'll notice is that there maybe is a lack of standardization. So for example, the ArcGIS REST API, they measure timestamps in what you might see as a format in FME is it seconds since the last epoch. So it's quite a long numeric string. But for some reason, they've gone in milliseconds. So you have to go ahead and manipulate all of your data before you actually can do something with it in like a date time converter. In terms of the FME Server REST API, naturally, everything is plug and play. All of the formats are standards which you can use. You don't have to kind of muck around with a whole lot more transformations in terms of, I guess, searching for strings with regexes and a whole lot more complex stuff. You pretty much can connect everything to a transformer and use the parameters rather than really having to kind of, I guess, get a bit creative in terms of how you transform that data. So basically, it makes your development quick and easy, and the amount of transformation is pretty low relative to some other APIs or other data for that matter. At this point, I think it's better to just let's go with an interactive demo. If you have seen my presentation before or any session that I run, I don't like to spend too much time talking about things. I'd rather spend time showing things. So please don't forget to make some suggestions for what you want to see. Otherwise, I will ramble on for the next 48 minutes that we've got left. So if you've got anything that you do want to see and it's possible, I will try and work that into today's session. Please just ask away because I want to make sure that you're obviously signed up for this because you've shown an interest in the FME Server REST API. So let me know what you want to see. There is a link to the FME Server REST API here, which you might want to access. You can just Google FME Server REST API. You don't have to type that explicitly to link there. That may give you some suggestions for what you actually want me to build, because sometimes you don't know what you want until you see it. If you don't have any ideas and you really just are here to observe, then observe away. Log a question if you do have any. I'm going to flip my camera off throughout the session. I'll probably pop it back on right at the end, but otherwise you'll see me staring at my second screen, looking like a bit of a gopher. So I'll just turn that off, but ask away and we'll get started otherwise. Okay, so I'll just exit that and show you a couple more links that I've got here. This is the FME Server app that I've created. If you've missed that link, it's very simple. I've just asked you to say, your name, where are you based, and what you'd like to see. So you don't have to get too in depth in terms of how you fill out that form. If I don't understand, I'll just call on you, or if you make it too hard, I'll probably just ignore you. So, all right. So I guess the first part of any API, though, is investigating the documentation. What I do really like about the way that the FME Server REST API works is that there's a link to it from your FME server. So here I've got just a basic FME server. It's pretty consequence-free environment because I've just set it up in AWS. So you'll also see there's not a huge amount of interest in there. But if you wanted to start working with the REST API in your own environment, what I always recommend, rather than going to the generic safe URL that you'll find by Google, is to go at it from your FME server. So if you click on this little question mark here and go down to the REST API, it goes to the REST API document for your FME server. So that's obviously going to have an influence on what version you're running. And saying that this REST API is very constant, it doesn't change, month to month like some things do. So looking at the safe one isn't going to make too much of a difference either. But the benefit of that is if I go into the API component and I just say, look at a basic call, and I'll just go to the health check one because I know that there's nothing really to unpack in there. And if I say show and hide and just expand on that, if I scroll down, what you'll see is that it actually builds the request URL for this FME server. If you have done any work with other, you'll have seen that it gives you kind of a relative path and asks you to figure out the URL yourself and trace through about 3 layers of documentation. If you just go straight to this site, it gives you the exact call that you need to make, which, yeah, makes life pretty easy in terms of, and lazy for me as well. The first step of any API call, though, of course, is to figure out the authentication component. This is quite a simple authentication. Some you'll see that there's quite an elaborate workflow where you've got to do about 3 steps in order to make sure that you have the correct permission to do anything. But on this overview page, if you scroll down, you'll see here authorization and a token is required to access the REST API. So this token says I have the appropriate permissions to do what you're asking me to do, and that acts in lieu of you typing in your username and password, which if anyone's on 2018 or newer, I hope you're still not running admin like you were allowed to. So I'm just going to go ahead and build this authorization component first to begin with, because that is the first step for absolutely any call that you want to make, is having the correct authentication. So I'm just going to jump across to FME and add a creator and an HTTP caller. Okay. So if you haven't worked with creators and HTTP callers much, a creator is basically, in lieu of the beginning of your workflow, it just triggers a feature in order for you to actually make, I guess, actions, because there has to be something moving through your workspace in order to complete an action. Inside my HTTP caller, I actually need to configure this the way that it's suggested in the documentation. So if I just jump back to that documentation for a moment, you see what it says here is that that you have to provide this with every request. You can be specified in a header or a query string or form parameter, but for security reasons, the token in a header is the preferred method. Sometimes that's not possible with the system that you're using, but if it is, always go with that method. It's just more secure because you're not exposing that token as part of the URL that you're hitting. So here you can see that I need to type authorization and FME token. Token is the value of the token. So if I populate that here under headers, authorization is going to autofill for me. FME token space token equals. And now I need to populate my token into there. So to get a token, you've got 2 options. If you're working in development, you can just request one up here. This will create a token essentially for, I think, 60 minutes. So I can do that here. In this case, it'll ask me to give my username and password, and it's just going to create a temporary token for the space for now. But of course, remember not to use that in your production applications. So get token, it just creates a temp token for me. And if I copy that and paste that here, That should give me the appropriate permissions to make any requests. In long term, you want to register your own token up here under manage tokens. I created one for this yesterday, called it master token. That only shows you that token at one point, so do make sure that you save it. Again, I'm in a consequence-free environment, so I've given it all permissions, but do be mindful of the permissions that you give to your tokens. Okay, so now that I have authorization, I can go through and test a call you want to make. In this case, let's go with the health check one because it has no parameters. So Safe have kindly built this query for me already. So let's just go ahead and copy it. And that says that the type of request that we need to make is a GET. So that's the parameter which you set on your HTTP method. As far as that call goes, it should be as simple as that. I'm just going to go ahead and save this because, well, it's a very stable program. You never like to chance things too much when you're running a demo either. Working. I'll just call this automation information. Okay, so I run that and you can see my status is okay. That's all that the health check returns is a simple, is it okay or is it not okay? My server not be okay, so I'm not actually sure what the opposite of that is. Yeah, and I guess to show you the authentication not working, is if I don't know, mess with the token a bit. Returns okay. I'm pretty sure you actually don't need a token to return the health check because it is just polling it to see if it's okay. I don't think it's an authenticated query now that I think about it. Here you go. Yeah, load balancer or other systems can monitor FME server using this endpoint without supplying token or password credentials. So I think that's one of the exceptions where it doesn't actually require any authentication. And saying that, I'm just going to build a few more components to this. Take a glance and see if we've had any suggestions come through. But I guess kind of like I said at the very start is that REST APIs, if you haven't worked with them before, can be a little bit, I guess, daunting because they are quite different. But in saying that, if you've got, I guess, a little bit of knowledge in how to unpack them, they become easy no matter what the API is. So what I'm going to do is just build, I think about, I use 5 transformers typically to make a request, to unpack it and expose them as attributes so that you've turned that response into a table. So I'm going to kind of build just a little, I guess, a template for us to work through because those are the things that I would do almost every single time, no matter what the API is. And hopefully that'll kind of indicate, I guess, the repeatable nature of unpacking an API. So this includes an HTTP caller, a JSON flattener, a list exploder, and an attribute exposer. And that is generally the kind of 5 transformers that I would use every time, almost every time, give or take anyway. Okay, so that's just my sample. Like good developer or FME user, I don't like to reinvent the wheel, so let's go ahead and use this as kind of a framework for a good time. We may not need all of those components every time, but it's good to know we have. They're there if we do. I'm just going to quickly check, see if we've had any questions come through. I've had one come through from Manu in Sydney. Using GNAF geocoding services. I haven't come across those before, Manu. Is that something that you want to elaborate on?
Can I speak right now or later?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's great.
Okay. So the thing is, basically, I'm just looking for the solution for like getting it directly data from the data.gov.au as a REST services, the geocode of GNAF, and then you process it. That's my basic question. So what data.gov provide is they provide the like 7 GB data set of the whole address booklet of the whole Australia. So if we can get it as a REST services and process it, and then I can save my time. That
have you got an endpoint for a geocoder there, or
it's not the endpoint geocoded there, but I just thinking to be putting as that geocoded address file as a geocoder. That's my point.
okay? I think that might not be quite where we want to go with this session.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. So I just think.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely see the value in that. I think you obviously have the ability to, use a geocoder transformer, which probably isn't going to work in your case.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably more likely that you've got an endpoint which has a geocoder, and you'd need to make a request against that. For this session, though, I do want to limit this to using the FME Server REST API.
Yep.
As opposed to going down the road of another one. But yeah, feel free to send that through in an email afterwards, because I'm sure there's a way to do it as well.
Yep.
But I might get a little bit down a rabbit hole just for the moment.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
No worries. One moment. I have had an email come through from one of our attendees just letting us know that IT has blocked my website, possibly because I've only exposed that over HTTP. I haven't installed certificates. If you are having that issue, maybe just drop a message into the comments, and I might have to rely on one of my colleagues to just flip those through into an email for me. If you do have anything that you'd like to see, yeah, just drop it into the comments and I could look at there if you can't see anything coming through, if you can't access that site. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead while we wait for a few more things to come in then as well. And I guess just start working through maybe a few examples that I've got here. So that was my sample one there. I'm just going to go ahead and make a duplicate of that. And you'll see here, initiator stays the same. Server. Auth check. So if you haven't unpacked API responses before, which is JSON, basically you run it through these transformers. So in this case, a JSON flattener, and we're going to point this at the response body. If I run to this, we can see that when I flatten it, I should see in my feature information window, I should see those attributes now exposed as attributes, whereas beforehand we only have response body. It actually starts to register those as bona fide attributes. So in this case, because there's only one value here, I don't actually need a list exploder. That works really well when I have multiple results returned from the query that I've made. In this case, though, I only have one value to see, so that is status. I run that, and I can now see the status as a message of OK. I don't a genuine workflow for this, but let's say you did just want to poll FME server every hour, every half an hour, something like that, just from another system to determine that everything is running as expected. Let's just check that the status is okay, and that's a pass. If not, if it's a pass, then we don't need to do anything. If not, maybe you'd want to do something like connect that to an emailer and let someone know that your FME server is not okay and it needs a bit of looking at. So I'm just going to type a bit of annotation. Expose response into attributes. And let's just say check if server is okay. Cool. So that's a pretty simple way just to check that your FME server is okay. Let's go ahead and do maybe a backup, because that is something that I have heard before in the past. Obviously, within FME server, it's quite easy to do, a backup. I'm sure a lot of you out there are probably on 2021 now as well. So apologies, I'm on 2020 here. It's funny how quickly you get used to a new version, but this is just an old server it's sitting there ready to go. So yeah, it's very easy to go ahead and do a backup just like this. But that obviously isn't great for the fact that you need to do the backup yourself. So perhaps as an administrator, you might have a use case where you actually all of the configuration of your FME server on, any sort of frequency. So let's go ahead and work through that now. So on my FME Server REST API, you have a scroll through here, and you can, some things are quite obvious, some not so much. This one's all right because under migration, you can see that there's backup and restore FME server configuration. So under this one, you can see we actually want to go for a migration and a backup and a download. You could download that as a resource, but of course then this the backup that you perform actually stays on the FME server itself, which I guess is maybe not such a great idea if the reason that you're doing a backup is in case that machine disappears or gets blown away or whatever the case is. It's probably not such a great place to back it up onto the same machine itself as part of the FME server config. So in this instance, I'd suggest going for a migration, backup, download. And this is quite a simple request as well. You can see here, if I scroll down to the request, you can see that URL that I need to use. So I'm going to copy that. I've got to copy my sample bookmark. One moment. And I'll just copy that again. So you need multiple clipboards. Okay, so the request URL, I've pasted that value in here. I can, of course, leave that authorization to be exactly the same value. The token will apply to the previous call as it will to this call. There is a few other things I need to configure here, though. And this documentation, color codes things really nicely. The first and foremost thing you can see here is that where beforehand we were asking for a GET request, this actually needs to be made over protocol instead. So that's as simple as changing the GET to a POST. And now there's a few other things that I might need to configure. In this instance, though, all I really want to do is choose my export package name. So you can see here how it suggests to make it in the request body. So export package name is FME Server config package. If I change that to automating automation, you see it's updated it for me nicely. And .fsconfig is the extension which FME uses to export configuration for an FME server. So if I copy that and choose that into my request body, I now just have, I think, one or two other things here. And this is under the request headers. So these are quite important. Sometimes you can get away with not setting them. Sometimes you can't. But it's always a good idea to do what's recommended on the documentation, purely for the fact that you'll save yourself a lot of trouble in trying to track down something which isn't working. For some, as the request headers, which are expected. So I'm going to just enter these as well. So see under headers, content dash, I think type was what we were asking for. And it was application. Oh, sorry, I've put it in the wrong place. Apologies. I actually need to populate that somewhere else. I think what we actually want to do is populate our accept in here. And it was something to do with octet string application. I think that might be right. And it was under content type here. That's where I was getting a bit confused. That's a parameter under the specify upload body. And it's just making sure that, you know, rather than expecting this as text plain, it's expecting it as this other type of content which we're giving it. I think we should be good here. In this case, I'm not actually trying to unpack app data as attribute. I don't need any of the next transformers. And this is FME config. Oop, got fat fingers. Just quickly save that. Let's just see what we get there. I'm looking at that now, and I think I have missed a parameter or two, but that's okay. We'll see what happens. Yes, I know exactly what I've forgotten. And that is saving response body too. So I don't want all of the FME server config as an attribute. That's actually to me. I want to store that as a file so that it could actually be used and accessed in the future. So let me just stop that and swap that over to a file. Now, this would be, I guess, a good idea to make some sort of dynamic naming convention so that we don't have, say, a backup done. Let's say, for instance, you're doing it on a weekly basis, and in a month's time, you find out that something went wrong. It's a good idea to probably date stamp those rather than just overwriting with the same name. So in this instance, I would recommend, you know, putting a query in here which gives it something unique so that you're not going to get the same thing overriding each other every single time. I'm going to cheat. I've actually pre-typed this in a separate window so that you don't have to see me messing around with date time formatting queries. And you'll see if I open that in the text editor, my text editor is a little bit messy on the second screen. For some reason, everything gets on top of each other. But basically what's happening there is there's a prefix here called Kieran server backup. And then I've just written a function which wraps two functions together. So we do a date time format of the current date stamp, but we format that in terms of something which I guess we'd expect here to see day, month, year. So all going well, I should actually be able to run that now, and we download the configuration from this FME server. All going well. And you can see there the HTTP download is starting, and it's quite large. I think usually, depending on how big your server is, or on your server, you can expect something like a couple of 100 megabytes. So that might be different if you've got a whole lot on there, but yeah, tend to expect a couple of 100 megs possibly in terms of how big an FME server backup might be. I'm just going to check in with our other, if we've had any more suggestions come back. Struggling with a second window there. Okay, so let me just go ahead and check the working directory and see if that downloaded. Just struggling a little bit there with my two screens. So every time I pop something up on the other screen, it tries to default back to this one. So over here, you can see, hopefully, yeah, Kieran server back. And you see we've got today's date stamp wrapped into that, 23rd of the 11th, 2021, and it's 200 and roughly 250 megs. That's really cool because, I mean, that's a simple query. And what we've done is just basically automated our backing up of our FME server config. If I wanted to, it would be as simple as publishing these two transformers up to FME server and setting that on a schedule to run on a weekly basis. You'd obviously probably want to do something long-term, like go and purge them. If you're running it on a weekly or a monthly basis, that could get quite big quite quickly. So yeah, possibly not a bad idea to set up another thing which is going to go and purge them based on that date stamp anyway. Okay. I have forgotten to do one thing, which I would recommend, and I mean, every workspace, it's a good idea to set some parameters up. So I'm just going to quickly do that. So in this instance, I would suggest parameterizing your token and parameterizing your FME server host name as well. That'll mean it's really easy in terms of if your token changes and you want to replace it with another one, you can replace it everywhere in one instance rather than going through every transformer which uses it. And similarly, if you say have a 3-stack environment like test, pre-prod, and prod, it means that with a host parameterized, you can just swap that host out and it will replace your FME server host and all of the transformers that use it rather than having to go and manually do it yourself. So I'm just going to make this a parameter. So FME server hostname. Of course, it is required. I could probably leave that as a private parameter though. And in this instance, I'm going to go with HTTP. Oops, no dot there. .com. Let's try it. Now, similarly, we'll do that with our token. Probably best not to leave that as published as well, but it is of course required, or you're going to have someone submit something with no token, which isn't going to work. And I'm just going to copy that value again and paste that into here. And we've got that in here. That means it should be as simple as, say, swapping out host and where my token is in this case. Token. I think that's how I named my parameters, but let me just double check. Yeah, no consistency, caps, and then camel. All right. Okay, let's see what else we could look at here. Yeah, keep sending through those suggestions if anyone has anything in particular that they'd like to look at. Don't forget to go to this site here and send through a question. It'd be great to get as many suggestions coming through with the time remaining that we do have. What have I done there? That is a great suggestion from Peter in Brisbane. That is something that I actually wanted to look at and I was going to use to kill time. So I'm very grateful you actually asked about that, Peter. That is something that has been on my radar for a little while. So Peter's asked, yeah, if we could start and stop automations using the REST API. So you'll see that there's actually no, there is actually a call for that. And if we look at the documentation, actually, yes, here we go. So you see here under automations and auto manager, there is here a put call, which is automations, workflows, ID, and enabled. So enable or disable an automation workflow. So this is really handy for, yeah, if you do have something which is built on an automation and you maybe are worried about it for a certain period of time, maybe there's a time window that you want to work within as well. You could set something up to enable or disable. Just quickly build this. I'll also then show another one which I've done for FME server apps as well and explain, yeah, a little bit about that one. So I guess the first part is let's just check that I actually have an automation here. It's been a while since I've been on this server, so yep, I do. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is say, I'm going to start all of these automations. Hopefully none of them are too laborious and resource intensive for this server to handle. Nah, this one doesn't want to start. It's okay. I think we can handle just having this many started. So I'm going to go through and build up a pretty simple workflow to, I guess, first of all, fetch all of my automations. So let's paste this and say get automations. And oops. Post and token So in this instance, though, we need to configure this query a little bit different. So let's first of all look at these automation calls. So there's a few different ones here. And in particular, obviously, we are wanting to enable or disable an automation. I guess the component of that, though, as well, is that you see on the under the parameters which are required. These are both required. An ID and a value. So something like an ID is not necessarily that easy to find. If you look at your, say, automations, there's no real apparent ID. I'm sure you can actually see that in the log somewhere. I'm just going to go ahead and build a quick workflow which fetches the ID of all of those automations at the same time. So the easiest way to do that, of course, is the REST. So you can see here, the very first call is a GET request, GET automations workflows. So in this case, you could parameterize this as much as you wanted in terms of only ones which are enabled, disabled, the maximum number. My server's not that big, so I don't need to really mess around with too many of them. But my query is good up to the host part. FME Server REST v3. So after automations is where after v3 is where I'm gonna replace with this component. And I'll paste that there. Now we just run that workflow as a GET. And you'll see here in my response, a whole lot of JSON, which might be a bit overwhelming to unpack at first. But just with these transformers, which are kind of pre-canned and ended up not really using, we'll just unpack that really quickly. So my JSON document, that is the response body. I'm going to leave this as is. And this is my hack for any API, basically, that's JSON, or you could do it with XML and use an XML flattener, is basically just to tell it the attribute which contains your response. And by default, that's always response body. And just run through it with nothing else set. Now, if you click, to inspect that data, and what you want to make sure is that your feature information window is turned on, and select the record so that it updates it. What you get here is basically it's unpacked that whole response in terms of it's identified what the list is called, shown you with those curly braces, and then it's also shown you what attributes exist. So now I can really easily actually expose that list, because in order to explode the list, first of all, I need to tell FME that it exists. So under attributes to expose, just going to type items and the curly brace. You can, of course, do that in here. You could expose your attributes. I could expose items, curly brace, dot name in order to expose that by default, but I'm incredibly lazy. And with, I guess, 2020, I think it came out, I guess the look ahead in terms of look behind and searching through the feature cache, it means that you can just type ahead and expose them really much easier using the attribute exposer. So just going to go ahead and expose the list. Now explode the list. It's going to turn my one response into individual records. Now that's great, but I haven't exposed my attributes yet. So I run that through an attribute exposer, and you can see here all of those attributes which are inside the JSON response have actually been made available inside the attribute exposer. So in this instance, let's just say have a look at the ID and the name. I'm not really interested in anything else. And you can see now I've got a whole bunch of IDs and the names of them. So if we flip back to my FME server, you see these names, building updates, Gmail, test, incoming building footprints, etc. These all relate to the automations that I've pulled using that GET request. So now that we have our ID, we go to the important part. So that's going to use another HTTP caller. We, of course, in a, I guess, more of a production setting, wouldn't need to use this first step all the time. It's probably unlikely that we want to turn them all on or off. You'd probably just go and manually find the ID of the automation that you're interested in and hard coding it. But it's good to know that you can pull them out this way as well. So get automations. Now, what I want to do is actually configure this request to match the one that we looked at on the REST API before. Okay. And under here, you see, yeah, the automations, workflows, ID/enabled. Okay, so if I flick back across to my FME workspace right now, and I just want to reconfigure my URL so that where I had automations and workflows before, I want to then also tack on the unique ID and the enabled for. So we can get rid of the excess there. Say /. In this case, I can type at value ID / enabled. And of course, I need to change that method to a put. Okay. And now let's just check if there's anything else I actually need to configure. Of course, a parameter value for true or false. So here under my request headers, I need to set that content type, and I also just need to set the value to true or false. So in this case, let's make sure that first of all I set these content type parameters and accept key. Application /J. And in this case, let's say value equals, let's say false, because what I have on my server here is everything is enabled. So the call that we're making, of course, says automation value ID is enabled. So enabled equals true would mean that it's going to turn them all on. Enabled value equals false, hopefully turn them all off. So let's give that a whirl and see. Is anything before we run it, save it. Okay, now you see with our status code 204 and no response. To me, that indicates that we've probably had some success, but here's the best way to go ahead and test. What we're looking for is if I refresh this page, we should see all of these, the state turn from started where we've got a green tick. We should see them all trigger and hopefully show a stopped state. Perfect. Cool. And to turn them all back on, let's go ahead and do that. So the easiest way to do that would be change the value to true. And run that. So we're getting a rejection there. Now I think that's to do with that same one that we couldn't start beforehand. For whatever reason, I think that's corrupted. I honestly don't know. This is a training server that I usually run the FME Server authoring course on. So there's a good chance I've just done something that I shouldn't have in there. So let's make sure that we actually set my workspace parameters, rejected feature handling. Let's say continue, because rather than that second one, I actually want to, obviously reject it, but also process all the others in this case. Cool. 8 success and 1 rejected. So I don't know what error that is, but something's not happy there. Wouldn't let us do it in the GUI, so it's unlikely to let us do it in the API as well. Well, we should see all except the Gmail test return back to started. And it's, I guess, as simple as that. We are approaching the time here, so I'm just going to have a quick check to see if there was anything else that popped through. Feel free to duck away if you are booked up with another meeting, or stick around for a couple more minutes, just as I wrap things up. Yeah, and we are going to make this available to everyone afterwards. So if you do need to duck away, feel free to take off. But that was one in particular. Thanks for suggesting that, Peter. Is that I have seen in my travels, FME Server in the past has very much been, used a lot for. I guess it's been used a lot for scheduling. And in the most recent releases, we have seen such a trend heading towards self-service and automation. And I guess I've seen quite a lot of apprehension around in terms of people not wanting to expose that because of the interference that it could have on their scheduled tasks, which are incredibly important, and you want to make sure that you don't interfere with, because that's the bread and butter, and that is usually the reason that you have FME in the first place. Something like that where you turn things on and turn things off can work incredibly well, because you have the ability to automate that. So I'd actually pre-can something, which I now don't really need to show, but that workspace app which I had made available, and apps are one of the primary sort of suggestions around one of the most, I guess, primary suggestions around the self-service tools. Is one of those things that you're like, oh, I don't really want to make my FME server engines available to anyone because they may occupy it. So you can, I guess, FME server apps and then have them turn off at a certain time. And the way to do that would be by disabling the token. So I'd pre-can something here, which is essentially the same thing as disabling the automation, but it was around tokens instead. So I had built a simple workflow here, which I'm just going to copy from my other screen and paste in since we're getting low on time. And this is enable or disable a token. So this allows me to change the state of a token. And in this case, I was going to do it on the Workspace app, which I've been asking you to submit your feedback via. So it's pretty much exactly the same call as we just built with the automations instead, except that it's under tokens, and then it's under the user and the name of the token, as opposed to the ID of the automation. You can see it's a put, but basically other than that, it's the same. So under that, what we have the ability to do is let's go ahead and I can turn off that application. So I'm just going to say value equals false. And this here, the Workspace app ask token is under my tokens here. And this token manages the Workspace app ask. So right now, all going well, I can still access that application. I run this Workspace. And if we have a look here, my application is now inaccessible. So I guess that's something that I could see there being a bit of benefit for anyone who is keen to start opening the doors to self-service in your organization, but is maybe a bit concerned about, I guess, giving free access to your engines. Obviously, this isn't the nicest workflow just to make it inaccessible, but you could have a big notification or some text here in red that just says that I guess that this portal is accessible between the hours of 7:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. Outside of this time, expect that it's not here. And that would, very much make it, I guess, open the door to self-serve, make sure that you don't hinder yourself in the process or occupy your engines where you don't want to. If you do that well as well, so I parameterized this and published it, and made a schedule here. So if I go to my schedules, you could make that a very, a very simple thing that only contains like two transformers, and you parameterize that workspace to say, I want it to be enabled or disabled, and you use that same workspace, enable it or disable it, scheduling it daily at 5 p.m. with the disabled, and then make another schedule which changes it back to enabled at 7:30 a.m. So you've automated the ability to have people come into your, to use your self-service portal. And I guess opened it up, but not hurt yourself in the process. Cool. I'm aware I've run over time, so I think at that point it's probably a good idea for me to wrap up. I'll just quickly check and see if we have had anything else come through, and maybe take a quick glance at the team's messages as well. I've had a message come through from one of my colleagues just around the, I think we may have a few FME Cloud users on the line as well. So it's good to know it is also an FME Cloud API. Cheers for that suggestion, Gary. Because you may want to say, look at a few other things which relate more to your cloud instance as opposed to an FME server instance. So maybe if you wanted to go down the road of, I guess, some more administration from an FME cloud perspective, it may be a good idea to start looking at this. And hopefully some of these tools which we've looked at as part of the session may help you to unpack this a lot easier as well. But I can imagine that it will be pretty straightforward to use if you want to start unpacking that with FME as well. Cool. I think at that point, probably a good idea I start to wrap things up. Give me one moment. Going to dart back around. All right. Yeah, thanks for joining. I hope that's been a helpful session for everyone, and feel free to send us through some feedback about what you thought about the format of the session. Yeah, hopefully that's been of some interest to everyone out there. I know it's a bit of a different format, so we are interested to hear how you found it as well. But we really did just want to, get in touch with our customers more than we've been able to recently, and just try something different as well. Yeah, so thanks for joining. Get in touch with us if you've got any more questions or follow-ups as well, and yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. So cheers.